45 and 40, 50 now. Do I hear 50? Going for 50. Last call.
The men standing near the cashier's table at the farm auction were laughing. Not quietly either. The kind of laugh that carries across a muddy lot and makes people turn their heads. Robert Hayes heard it, even though he kept his eyes on the piece of paper in his hand. The auction catalogue was wrinkled from being folded and unfolded all afternoon, but his eyes weren't really reading it anymore. They were looking past it, looking at the tractor. Because the truth is, that tractor looked terrible. The red paint had faded so badly it was closer to pink than red. One rear tire was half flat. Rust had crept along the edges of the hood. Weeds had grown up through the cultivator frame underneath it, like the machine had already been abandoned for years. Most of the serious bidders had left hours ago. They had come for the shiny equipment, the newer tractors, the machines with clean paint and plenty of life left in them. What remained in the yard now were the leftovers, the things people politely called projects, or less politely. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Junk. The auctioneer wiped his brow and flipped to the next page. Lot 47, he called out. 1951 Farmall M runs, needs some work. He paused, looking around the small crowd that remained. Do I hear 500? Silence. A few men shifted their boots in the mud. Someone coughed. The tractor sat there quietly, like it already knew nobody wanted it. 400. The auctioneer tried. Nothing. One of the men near the back chuckled. Another leaned toward his friend and muttered something that made the two of them grin. The auctioneer waited a moment longer before sighing. 300 to start it then. Robert raised his bidding card. Not high, just enough for the auctioneer to see it. The auctioneer nodded. 300 I've got. Looking for 350. No one moved. The crowd had already made its decision. This machine wasn't worth their time. Going once at 300, Robert stood quietly, hands in his coat pockets. Going twice. The auctioneer lifted the gavel. Sold. Bidder 92. The small wooden hammer cracked down on the podium, and just like that, Robert Hayes had bought a tractor for $300. As he walked toward the cashier's table to settle the bill, he passed two men wearing bright green caps. John Deere caps. Their boots were clean, their shirts pressed. They didn't look like farmers. They looked like salesmen. One of them nudged the other and tilted his head toward Robert. That's him, he said. The second man squinted. Who? Hayes. Recognition crossed his face. Oh, that guy. He chuckled. Bought another one, did he? The first man nodded toward the yard. That Farmall. The second man laughed louder this time. How many of those antiques does he run? Now? 2, I think. Maybe 3? The man shook his head, smiling the way people smile when they think someone else is foolish. I don't know how he expects to compete farming with equipment that should be in a scrapyard. His friend shrugged. He doesn't compete. He survives. Barely. They both laughed again. Robert heard every word, but he didn't say anything. He paid his $300, folded the receipt into his pocket, and walked out into the muddy lot. Because the truth is, those men thought they understood what they were seeing, but they didn't, not even close. And by the time the story of Robert Hayes was finished, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. But to understand why, we need to go back 6 years. Back to 1973. Robert Hayes was 31 years old that year. He didn't inherit his farm, didn't grow up on land that had been passed down through generations. He had bought his 280 acres himself, every acre of it. He had spent years working construction jobs, saving money, doing custom harvesting for other farmers during harvest season, long days, longer nights. But eventually he had scraped together enough money to buy a farm of his own. And the first tractor he ever owned was a 1953 Farmall Super M. He had paid $1,200 for it. At the time, most farmers were already upgrading to newer machines, but Robert didn't mind the age because he understood something important. Old machines could still work, if you knew how to take care of them. That first winter, he spent nearly 2 months rebuilding. The tractor, new seals, fresh bearings, cleaning every part of the engine. When he finished, the tractor ran like it had 20 years of life left in it. And for the next 5 seasons, that's exactly what it gave him. The Farmall plowed his fields, pulled his equipment, harvested his crops, everything he needed. But by 1973, something had changed. One of Robert's neighbors was retiring, and the neighbor offered him the chance to lease another 160 acres for a farmer trying to grow his operation. That opportunity was huge. Robert took it. But there was a problem. One tractor wasn't enough anymore. With the extra land, the workload had doubled. He had a choice to make. And most farmers in that situation made the same decision. They went to the implement dealer, traded in the old tractor, financed something newer, something bigger, something more powerful. Robert even went and looked. A dealer showed him a 5-year-old John Deere 4020, nice machine, strong, reliable. But when Robert sat down at his kitchen table that night with a yellow legal pad and a calculator, the numbers told a different story. The dealer's financing plan meant about $300 a month for 5 years, $18,000 total with interest. That was the cost of upgrading. Robert sat there staring at the numbers for a long time. Then he flipped to a new page and wrote a different plan. Instead of buying one expensive tractor, he could buy another old one, maybe $1,000, spend a few hundred on parts, fix it himself, own it outright. No payments, no interest, no risk. The math wasn't even close. When he explained the idea to his wife, Linda, she listened quietly. "You're going to buy another old tractor?" she asked. "I am. People will think we can't afford better." Robert shrugged. "Let them think whatever they want." He leaned back in his chair. "We're farming for us, not for them." Linda smiled, because she knew something about her husband. Once Robert Hayes made a decision, he stuck with it. That summer, he found a 1949 Farmall M for $900. The tractor needed work. The carburetor had problems. The clutch slipped. The wiring looked like someone had repaired it with a handful of scrap wire. But Robert wasn't worried. Over 3 weeks, he rebuilt the carburetor, installed a new clutch, replaced the electrical system. When he finished, the tractor ran perfectly. Now he had 2 machines, 2 tractors that together could handle his expanding farm, and he didn't owe anyone a dime, the neighbors noticed. At the feed store, people talked. At church, they talked. At the co-op, they talked, some. Farmers respected the decision, but many didn't. Hayes is farming like it's 1950. He'll work himself to death with those old machines. The implement dealers were the loudest critics. Salesmen from companies like John Deere and International Harvester worked that region constantly, and farmers like Robert were a problem for them, because their business depended on something very simple. Farmers upgrading, financing, buying new equipment every few years. Robert Hayes wasn't doing any of that. One salesman even said it within earshot of Robert one afternoon. "Those old Farmalls are time bombs, false economy. You save a little money now, then spend twice as much fixing them later." Robert didn't argue. He simply kept farming because he believed the numbers, and the numbers were about to prove him right. In October of 1973, everything changed. The oil crisis hit. Fuel prices exploded almost overnight. Diesel that farmers had relied on for years suddenly cost 2, sometimes 3 times more than it had before. Large modern tractors burned fuel fast. Some operations were using 50 or 60 gallons a day during peak season, and suddenly that fuel bill became enormous. Farmers who had carefully calculated their budgets found themselves scrambling. Robert's tractors used far less fuel. Their smaller engines were simpler, more efficient. His fuel costs went up like everyone else's, but nowhere near as dramatically. Then came another problem. Wheat prices collapsed. Input costs stayed. High farmers who were already carrying heavy debt suddenly found themselves underwater. Equipment payments didn't stop just because crop prices dropped. Banks still expected their money. And slowly, one by one, farms in the county began to disappear. 2, then 3, then 7. Between 1974 and 1976, 19 farms in that county were foreclosed or sold under financial pressure. Good farmers, hard workers, men who had followed every piece of advice the industry had given them. Upgrade your equipment. Expand your acreage. Increase production. Take on leverage. But when the economy shifted, that leverage crushed them. Robert watched neighbors pack up and leave land their families had worked for decades, and the entire time one thought kept repeating in his mind. The only difference between them and me is debt. They owed money. He didn't. And, standing in the middle of those hard years, Robert Hayes made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would never finance equipment again. Not once. If he couldn't pay cash, he wouldn't buy it. That decision would define the next 40 years of his farming career, and it would eventually turn a $300 tractor into the smartest investment he ever made. When Robert Hayes dragged that $300 tractor home from the auction, most people in the county assumed they already knew how the story would end. They had seen farmers like him before. Small operations, old equipment, always fixing something, always behind the big operations with their shiny machines. To most of them, Robert's little fleet of Farmalls looked less like a strategy and more like a stubborn refusal to accept reality. But the truth was something very different. Repairable. Nothing computerized. Nothing that required dealer diagnostics. Nothing that forced him into a service contract, and that independence gave him something most farmers didn't realize they were losing. Freedom. Because the truth is, when your equipment is financed, you don't fully own your operation, the bank does, and Robert Hayes refused to farm for a bank. By 1984, word had begun to spread around the county, not about his tractors, about something else. Survival. Farmers were noticing something strange, while other operations struggled under heavy equipment payments. Robert just kept going, planting, harvesting, year after year. That's when a young farmer named Scott Brennan showed up at Robert's farm one afternoon. Scott had inherited 200 acres from his father. The land was paid off, but the equipment was gone. His father had sold it before he died to pay medical bills. Scott stood in Robert's shed staring at the row of old Farmalls. "I don't understand something," he said. Robert was tightening a hydraulic line on one of the tractors. He didn't even look up. "What's that?" "Everyone tells me I need modern equipment. They say old stuff like this can't compete." Robert wiped his hands with a rag, then finally looked up. "Compete with who?" "The big farms," Scott said. "The guys farming thousands of acres." Robert leaned against the tractor. "You're never going to outproduce them," Scott frowned. "What do you mean?" "They've gotten times your land," Robert said, 10 times your machinery. That race is already lost." Scott looked confused. "Then how do you win?" Robert gestured toward the tractors. "You out-survive them." Scott blinked. "How?" "By not owing money." Robert walked slowly down the line of tractors in the shed. Old machines, faded paint, years of work behind them. "You know how many farms in this county have gone under in the last decade?" Scott shook his head. 19, Scott's eyes widened. 19. Every single one had something in common. What? Debt. Equipment, debt, land debt, operating loans. They borrowed to expand, borrowed to modernize, borrowed to compete. And when the market turned against them, the debt didn't care. Robert rested a hand on the hood of his 1949 Farmall. "These tractors might not be worth $10,000 combined, but they don't owe anybody anything. That means I can survive bad years. I can survive low prices. I can survive drought." Scott was quiet for a long moment. "So what should I do?" Robert didn't hesitate. "Buy old equipment, pay cash, learn to fix it yourself, keep your costs low." Scott followed that advice, bought 2 used Farmalls, picked up implements at auctions, spent months learning to repair everything himself. 10 years later, Scott owned his farm outright and had expanded to nearly 500 acres. Meanwhile, the dealer who once told him he couldn't compete with old equipment had closed his business. By 1990, Robert Hayes had been farming more than 20 years. He had survived the oil crisis of the 70s, the farm crisis of the 80s. Drought, market crashes, hailstorms, everything agriculture could throw at a farmer, and he was still there, still farming, still independent, still running tractors. Most people said should have been retired decades earlier, Fourth Farmall eventually joined the others. A 1954 Super H he bought for $400. 4 tractors now, all paid for, all reliable. And something interesting had happened in the county. The implement dealers weren't laughing anymore because the farmers who had financed new machines, many of them were gone. But Robert Hayes kept showing up every season, planting, harvesting, proving that there was another way to farm. Then one evening in 1993, something happened that perfectly summed up Robert's philosophy. At the annual county Farm Bureau dinner, a regional equipment dealer was giving a presentation talking about modern agriculture, technology, GPS guidance, computerized systems. Farming today requires leverage, the dealer explained confidently. You use borrowed capital to scale up production. That's how successful operations grow. Most people nodded politely. Robert stood quietly near the back of the room, listening. Finally, he took a sip of his drink and said something that made the entire room go silent. That's also how you lose everything. The dealer frowned. What do you mean? Robert set his glass down. How many of the farms that went under in this county were heavily financed? No one answered. Robert continued. I'm not saying new tractors are bad machines. I'm saying the business model. Behind them benefits dealers and banks, not farmers. The room stayed quiet because everyone knew he was right. Robert Hayes never became the biggest farmer in the county, never farmed thousands of acres, never chased maximum production. Instead, he chased something far more important: stability, independence, ownership, and that $300 tractor that dealers laughed about at the auction. It worked on his farm for more than 20 years, long after some of those dealers had left the business, long after the farmers who mocked him had disappeared. Because in the end, Robert Hayes proved something simple. The goal of farming isn't to look successful, it's to still be farming when everyone else is gone. And 40 years after that muddy auction, Robert Hayes was still there, still on the same land he bought decades earlier, still working on tractors in his shed, still teaching young farmers the lesson that saved his farm. That the most powerful machine a farmer can own is the one that doesn't belong to the bank. Years passed, and the story of Robert Hayes slowly turned into something people in the county talked about in quieter tones. At first, it had been mockery, farmers leaning against pickup trucks at the co-op, shaking their heads. Hayes is still running those old Farmalls. Man's farming like it's 1950. But time has a strange way of changing conversations, because every year that went by, something unexpected kept happening. Robert Hayes didn't disappear. His farm didn't get sold. His tractors didn't sit abandoned in a weed-covered yard. Instead, season after season, people saw the same thing. Those old machines working, plowing in the spring, cultivating in the summer, harvesting in the fall, and every winter lights glowing in Robert's shop while he worked quietly on maintenance and repairs. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't impressive, but it was steady. And in farming, steady is everything. By the late 1980s, younger farmers had started to notice. They had grown up hearing about modern agriculture, bigger tractors, more horsepower, more technology. But they had also watched something else happen, their neighbors losing farms. Families leaving land that had been in their names for generations, not because they didn't work hard, not because they didn't know how to farm, but because the numbers stopped working. Payments, interest, loans stacked on top of loans, and then one bad year, one drought, one market collapse, that's all it took. Meanwhile, Robert Hayes kept showing up every season like clockwork. No new equipment, no giant loans, just those 4 old tractors sitting in his shed. Eventually, the curiosity grew strong enough that people began asking questions. One of those people was a young farmer named Daniel Carter. Daniel was in his late 20s when he first visited Robert's farm. His father had farmed the traditional way, upgrade equipment, finance machinery, expand acreage. For years the plan worked, until it didn't. A string of poor harvests had nearly pushed the Carter farm into bankruptcy. Daniel had watched his father age 10 years in the span of 2 seasons. One evening at the local feed store, an older farmer leaned over and said something that stuck in Daniel's mind. If you want to see how someone survives in farming, go talk to Robert Hayes. So Daniel did. He drove out to Robert's farm on a quiet Saturday morning. The place looked simply. No massive grain bins, no fleet of shiny machines, Just a tidy farmhouse, a long gravel driveway, and a weathered equipment shed. Inside that shed were the tractors, 4 of them, all Farmalls, all old, all still running. Robert was underneath one of them when Daniel walked in. Only his boots were visible at first. "Morning," Daniel said. The sound of metal tools stopped. Robert rolled out from under the tractor and sat up. "Morning," he replied. Daniel nodded toward the machines. "These are the famous tractors, huh?" Robert chuckled softly. "I don't know about famous, but they work." Daniel looked at them carefully. Faded paint, scratches, grease marks, machines that had clearly lived long lives. "My dad says equipment like this can't compete anymore," Daniel said. Robert wiped his hands with a rag. "Compete with what?" "Big operations, modern farms." Robert leaned against the workbench. "Let me tell you something," he said. "Farming isn't a race against other farmers." Daniel frowned. "It's not." "No." Robert shook his head slowly. "It's a survival test." Daniel stayed silent, listening. "The biggest mistake farmers make," Robert continued, "is believing the goal is to be the biggest operation. That's what everyone tells us." Robert nodded. "Dealers tell you that. Banks tell you that. Equipment companies tell you that, because they make money when you believe it." Daniel thought about that for a moment. "So, what's the real goal?" Robert looked out through the open shed door toward the fields beyond. "The real goal," he said quietly, "is still owning your farm 20 years from now." The words hung in the air. Daniel glanced back at the tractors. "These helped you do that?" "They helped," Robert said, "but they weren't the real reason." "What was?" Robert smiled slightly. "I never owed anyone anything." That idea seemed almost too simple, but the longer Daniel thought about it, the more powerful it felt. Because when you remove debt, everything changes. You can survive bad seasons, you can survive market crashes, you can survive drought, but when you're carrying large loans, those same problems become disasters. Daniel spent hours talking with Robert that day. They walked through the tractors. Robert explained how he evaluated old equipment at auctions, how he identified machines worth repairing, how preventive maintenance prevented expensive breakdowns. But more importantly, Robert talked about something deeper. Mindset. Farming isn't just about growing crops, he said. It's about managing risk, and debt is the biggest risk there is. Daniel left the farm that afternoon with a completely different way of thinking. Over the next year, he started making changes. He sold one of his newer financed machines, paid off part of the loan, started buying used equipment at auctions, learned to repair machinery himself. At first, some neighbors laughed. They said he was going backward, but Daniel didn't care, because he had seen proof that the strategy worked. Robert Hayes, a man who had quietly farmed through decades of chaos and never lost his land. By the time Robert reached his 60s, his reputation had changed completely. He was no longer the stubborn farmer with outdated equipment. Now people saw him differently. As a teacher, young farmers visited regularly. Some came for mechanical advice, others came for business advice, and many came simply to understand the philosophy that had allowed Robert to survive while others failed. One afternoon in 2005, Robert officially retired from active farming. He was 63 years old. But retirement didn't mean leaving the land. Instead, he leased his fields to one of the younger farmers he had mentored. The tractors stayed where they were, still in the shed, still running, still used occasionally on the farm. Robert spent his time doing something he enjoyed even more, working on machinery. Farmers from across the county began bringing him old equipment that needed rebuilding, vintage tractors, combines, implements that dealers refused to repair anymore. Robert became known as the man who could fix anything. He didn't charge much. Sometimes he didn't charge at all. Because for him, the work wasn't about money. It was about keeping farmers independent. Years later, during a farming podcast interview, the host asked Robert a question. "What's the biggest lesson you learned during your career?" Robert sat quietly for a moment before answering. "I think most farmers chase the wrong goal," he said. "What do you mean?" the host asked. "Most farmers are trying to make as much money as possible. That seems reasonable." Robert nodded. "It sounds reasonable. But it's actually dangerous. The host leaned forward. So, what should the goal be? Robert answered without hesitation. Survival. The host blinked. Survival. Yes. Because if you survive long enough, Robert explained, profit eventually takes care of itself. But if you chase profit too aggressively, you start borrowing, you start expanding, you take risks you can't control, and eventually something goes wrong. Robert paused. Something always goes wrong. The host asked one final question. So, the tractors, the old equipment, that was the secret. Robert laughed softly. No. The tractors weren't the point. They were just tools. The real strategy was staying out of debt. Years later, at a local farm show, Robert brought all 4 of his Farmalls and lined them up for display. People gathered around the machines. Young farmers climbed into the seats. Older farmers ran their hands across the faded red paint. One young man stood there for nearly 10 minutes, studying the tractors. Finally, he turned to Robert. Everyone tells me modern equipment is the only way to succeed, he said. But you farmed with these for 40 years. What's the truth? Robert looked at the row of tractors, machines, that had outlived countless newer ones. Then he smiled. The truth, he said, is that the industry wants you to believe farming is a competition. But it isn't. It's a test of endurance. The young farmer nodded slowly. Robert rested his hand on the hood of the oldest Farmall. The dealers laughed when I bought my second tractor, he said. They laughed when I bought the third. They laughed when I bought the fourth. He paused. But I'm still here. And that, more than anything else, proved his point. Because the tractors that people once called junk had carried a farm through 4 decades of uncertainty, and the man who bought them for a few $100s at muddy auctions had built something far more valuable than modern equipment. He built a life no bank could take away.